All Eileen Gu, Novak Djokovic, Simone Biles. I was just like, everywhere you look, there were stars, and everywhere you look, there are people who have made waves and touched lives and inspired so many. So just to be kind of in that room was a great pleasure.
There's a moment that happens to every great athlete, usually before anyone else notices them, where the world they've been chasing suddenly stops feeling distant and starts feeling real. And for a 19-year-old from the Philippines standing inside one of the most decorated rooms in global sports, that moment came not on a court, not under stadium lights, but at an award ceremony in Madrid, when her heart rate spiked and she felt it in her chest before she could even process what was happening. And the reason that moment matters, the reason we're still talking about it weeks later, isn't because of what the YouTube thumbnails told you, it's because of what actually happened, and more importantly, what happened the very next morning. Alex was 23 days removed from the best ranking of her career when she walked into the Palacio de Cibeles on the evening of April 20, 2026. She was ranked 44th in the world, which sounds impressive until you remember she'd been as high as 29th just weeks earlier, and the slide had started quietly, a first-round exit in Stuttgart against Leylah Fernandez and then a round of 16 loss in Linz against Ostapenko, two tournaments where things just didn't click. The kind of results that don't make headlines but absolutely eat at you when you're trying to build something real on the WTA Tour. Madrid was supposed to be the reset.
Alex, great job out there today. First match in these high altitude conditions.
Yes.
How did it feel?
It felt great. I think the intensity was really high throughout the whole match, so I'm really happy to have been able to...
The Laureus World Sports Awards, if you've never heard of it, is essentially the Oscars of the sporting world. Except instead of actors in designer suits thanking their agents, you get the most decorated athletes on the planet in one room, and this particular edition was co-hosted by Novak Djokovic, 24 Grand Slam titles, the most in men's tennis history, and Eileen Gu, 3 Olympic gold medals in freestyle skiing. And the room around them was just as staggering. John McEnroe was there. Elena Rybakina, Carlos Alcaraz, Aryna Sabalenka, Colombian player Camila Osorio, who happens to be the first ever Philippine Women's Open champion. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, Alex walked in wearing a cream Filipiniana gown, the traditional Filipino formal silhouette with those wide butterfly sleeves that you genuinely don't see anywhere else in the world, designed by her uncle, celebrated Filipino fashion designer Alex Eala, and in a room where most athletes were wrapped head to toe in luxury house sponsorship deals. Alex walked in wearing her national heritage on her back, and that detail, quiet as it was, said everything about who she's trying to be inside a sport that doesn't always make room for that kind of identity. But let's get to the moment everyone is actually here for, because at some point during the ceremony, Novak Djokovic and Eileen Gu walked over to Alex, and they took a selfie, and Alex posted it on her Instagram story with a caption that was essentially just a string of zeros, her way of saying she had no words. And that image, Alex right in the center flanked by both co-hosts, went viral across Filipino media the very next day, and then the headlines started multiplying, and then they started shifting, and then YouTube titles began appearing with phrasing that implied Djokovic had said something explosive, something accusatory, something that amounted to a public demand for accountability toward tournament organizers. And here is where the story gets interesting, because none of that is what Djokovic actually said. What Djokovic said about Alex, on the record, at the 2026 Australian Open was measured, warm, and specific. He described the crowd chaos around her first-round match as a very good problem to have. He called her the biggest tennis player the Philippines had ever produced. He pointed out that hundreds of supporters couldn't even get inside the venue to watch her play. That's not a condemnation, that's not an allegation, that's not a rallying cry. That's a 24-time Grand Slam champion recognizing a rising player and noting, with some admiration, the cultural weight she carries into every match she plays, but the amplified version of those words, the version that lived in comment sections and engagement thumbnails, reversed the meaning almost entirely. And that gap between what was said and what got circulated is exactly the kind of thing that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The day after the selfie went viral, April 22nd, Alex sat down for a post-match media session at the Madrid Open and gave the clearest and most honest account of what that Laureus encounter actually felt like. She said her heart rate spiked the moment Djokovic walked toward her. She called it a surreal experience. She described Eileen Gu as incredibly warm and genuinely inspiring. And what she did not say, not once, not even close, was that she felt overlooked or mistreated or that Djokovic was some kind of champion fighting on her behalf. What she described was a physical reaction, a full-body recognition of being in proximity to two of the most accomplished athletes alive. And if you've ever been in the presence of someone you've admired from a distance for years, someone whose career you've watched in highlight reels and press conferences and imagined from the outside, then you understand exactly what she meant, because your nervous system doesn't ask for permission before it reacts. It just reacts, and that is the verified record of what happened that night. Everything built on top of it is someone else's story projected onto hers.
No, you seem to be very happy to be back on the clay. How was your relationship with the surface at the moment?
It's getting better every year, I think. In general, I'm a better player this year now at this moment than I was last year. So I'm really confident with that. I've had some struggles on clay before, but I've also had some really great matches. So I'm really excited to see, there's a couple tournaments left. So I'm really
open draw. Less than a day after tournament organizers had made what was described as a major announcement about his participation, Djokovic officially withdrew, citing ongoing recovery from a shoulder and elbow injury he'd picked up at Indian Wells, where he'd lost in the fourth round to Jack Draper. His post was brief and gracious. Madrid, unfortunately I won't be able to compete this year. I'm continuing my recovery in order to be back soon. Hasta pronto. And just like that, the player whose name had become the center of the entire online conversation around Alex and Madrid 2026 was gone from the tournament before it even started. He was present at the Laureus ceremony, absent from the competition, and yet his footprint on this story is somehow larger than most of the players who actually showed up and competed. His withdrawal opened the door for players like Zverev and Ruud, but the cultural vacuum his name left behind got filled almost instantly by a selfie, a caption, and whatever story a particular audience was already primed and ready to believe. To really understand what Alex walking into that Laureus room meant, you also need to understand where she came from to get there, because she didn't just appear, she was built slowly, a product of a decade at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Spain, a detail that gets pulled into online narratives fairly often as some kind of evidence of political advantage or preferential treatment. But what it more accurately reflects is 10 years of integration into European clay court tennis culture, 10 years of training in one of the most demanding environments in the sport, and when Alex sat down with local journalists in Madrid and conducted press interviews in fluent, comfortable Spanish, journalists who weren't expecting it were visibly surprised, and that fluency wasn't a media strategy or a PR moment, it was what 10 years of actually living somewhere sounds like when you open your mouth. And it also explains something about the way she carries herself on clay, the ease, the patience in longer rallies, and the willingness to stay in points and trust the process that doesn't come from talent alone, that comes from years of absorbing a specific culture's relationship with the surface. And then came the morning that the thumbnails somehow forgot to make about.
You speak Spanish? Have you been working on that?
Oh, well, yeah, I've lived in Spain for a really long time already. And I did study Spanish in school there. So I do have some Spanish skills. It's just about, breaking that barrier of being shy, especially in the media. But yeah, I'm really trying to break past that barrier, as I said, and just be less shy and work on it a little bit more, because having a third language is a great thing.
The day after her heart was racing inside the Palacio de Cibeles, the day after the selfie went viral, the day after her name was trending for reasons that had nothing to do with tennis, Alex walked onto the Estadio Aranza Sanchez at the Caja Magica and beat Anastasia Pavlyuchenkova 6-3, 6-3 in 90 minutes. Pavlyuchenkova is 34 years old, a former French Open finalist, the kind of player who has seen everything, beaten everyone, and knows exactly how to slow a match down and make you uncomfortable. She was ranked 116th at the time after a difficult stretch on tour, but those numbers don't fully capture the experience she brings to a court, and Alex beat her cleanly. She saved 2 break points early in the first set, broke in the 5th game, stayed clean on serve, composed in the rallies, and handled the Madrid conditions, the high altitude, the thinner air that makes the ball travel faster and kick differently off the surface, with what one account described as pure emotionless calibration. And there is something deeply interesting about that phrase when you put it next to the heart rate spike she described from the night before. Because the narrative most people were building around Alex in those 48 hours was one of someone overwhelmed. Someone swept up in the emotion of the moment, but a 63-63 the morning after you've described a physical adrenaline rush from standing next to your heroes is not the performance of someone who got swept up, it's the performance of someone who absorbed it, processed it, and redirected it, and that is a very different story from the one the engagement bait was selling. Here's the part that gets lost when we reduce athletes to viral moments. The prize money for one win at the 2026 Madrid Open converted to roughly 2.1 million pesos for Alex, real money when you're funding a full professional team across the global tour, travel, coaching, hitting partners, and physiotherapy. None of it is cheap, and none of it stops when the cameras aren't watching, and Alex, at 44th in the world, was fighting to protect a seeding position that mattered heading into Roland Garros, because seedings at a Grand Slam aren't just about ego. They determine who you face in the early rounds, and the difference between a favorable early draw and a brutal one can be the difference between a deep run and an early exit that costs you weeks of momentum. So Madrid wasn't just a backdrop for a viral moment, it was a competitive correction, a chance to reclaim ground lost in Stuttgart and Linz, and the 6-3 against Pavlyuchenkova was the first real data point that the correction was actually working.
Available, and then a week ago I had this idea that I was like, I've always had a dream that kind of like when I'm in a red carpet I'll wear what's called the Filipiniana, and it's a very traditional Filipino form.
Her second round opponent was 19th seed Elise Mertens, a completely different challenge, more experienced and more comfortable in big tournament environments, the kind of opponent whose result would tell you something real about where Alex actually was, and that match was the next test, the next morning, where the cameras would mostly be pointed somewhere else and the only thing that would matter was the score. What this whole story is really about, underneath the selfie and the captions and the thumbnails and the controversy that wasn't quite a controversy, is a question that nobody in the engagement economy has much incentive to ask, because it doesn't fit in a title and it doesn't drive clicks, which is what happens if Alex actually runs deep in Madrid, what happens if she beats Mertens, what happens if she reaches the later rounds. What does the story look like when she arrives at Roland Garros? With a seeding that protects her from the most dangerous early draws, she was 29th in March, she slipped to 44th after two difficult tournaments, and Madrid was where she started climbing back, and the 6-3 played the morning after her heart was genuinely racing in one of the most glamorous rooms in world sports is the clearest possible signal that the emotional and the competitive are not separate things for her, they never have been. The Filipiniana gown and the Laureus selfie and the adrenaline spike and the crisp baseline winner on match point are all coming from the same place, a 19-year-old who has decided, fully and completely, that she belongs in every room she walks into, and the question that remains wide open as of late April 2026, the one that no headline has answered yet, is whether she can carry all of it, the heritage, the ranking, the expectation, the story, all the way to a Roland Garros draw that finally shows the world what she can do when everything aligns, because the selfie was beautiful and it was real and the moment was genuine, but the story was never about standing between two legends for a photograph, it was always about what you do the next morning when the spotlight moves on and the only thing left is the match in front of you.